It's a pleasure to be here in Hamilton. I haven't had the pleasure to come out to McMaster University yet, although I spent a fair bit of time talking with researchers at many universities in Ontario, looking at all kinds of issues related to the future, from climate change to the rise of mental health burdens among Canadians, to artificial intelligence and machine learning and digital culture, to the economic changes we're seeing in terms of rising economic precariousness. And all these things are factors that play into our future. So I've called this presentation From A to B, Mobility's Existential Crisis, because one of the challenges we face is that although we're improving a lot of things in technology, we're not realizing that certain foundations underneath everything we're building are actually crumbling a bit. So we have big plans. We have big plans for infrastructure, for example, and the infrastructure of the future is really about the promise of scaling the ability of people to be more mobile as they go through the different stages of life. So in this province, there's a $190 billion infrastructure plan. And over 12 years, that'll be about $16 billion a year spent on infrastructure, according to the plan. And presumably, with that infrastructure, you can do all the things we want to do. You can have solutions that support aging and mobility, autonomous vehicles, autonomous buses, accessible commuting, being more, and it's one of the big things that's happened in Ontario is that the GO trains are now more accessible, at least on some routes and on some trains. And of course, better urban design that makes it possible for all kinds of people of all kinds of different ages to move around environments more successfully and capably. And one of the most colorful picture that you're seeing there is the new Lego house that was just launched by Bjarke Ingels Group, the famous Danish architectural firm. And it has all kinds of mobility-related enhancements on the inside, but it's for children as well as for adults and those who are thrilled with the idea of play having an impact on their lives. Now, we have this assumption, we're going to spend this $190 billion, but let's think a bit. What if our best laid plans go awry? What if the government faces reduced tax revenues? What if the credit rating of the province is downgraded to the extent that funds have to be diverted from infrastructure to other things? What if there's smart city failures? Smart cities with lots of technology are more complex and create more interdependencies, which creates a greater risk of failure. And then, of course, what about climate change? What might that do to everything from life expectancy? There are questions about how we'll adapt to lives if there are multiple disasters over the next 10, 20, 30 years in terms of whether we're going to have more higher mental health burdens and more traumatized populations as a result of the risks that we face. So all these things could mean that there's going to be less of this, what we want to see, and a bit more of this. So these are bent railway tracks caused by extreme heat events in the UK, and we know we've had this problem with the GO trains in Ontario. So imagine now you're on the GO train, you have a mobility issue that requires you to have special access to the vehicle, and now your train is stuck. Now how are you going to deal with that question? So there needs to be an interconnection between thinking about how we're going to advance, how we're going to face some of the shocks that we're going to face, and how we're going to take care of people with mobility-related challenges, and how community can be responsive to that. So the idea here is to think more about repairability, ruggedness, and really smart design. So here behind you, you see, well, let's start with the four-wheel drive vehicle. Now, some people think that the future is all about electric cars. Some people think the future is all about vehicles that use less and less gas. Well, that might be true, But it might also be true if there's more damage to roads, if there are other kinds of issues, if we don't build out the electric grid infrastructure enough, that there's a bit of going back to the future. In Africa, for example, the Land Rover is still one of the most prized vehicles because it can be repaired and has been able to be repaired for about 50 years. And so we have to think about those sorts of things as well. How are we going to repair and maintain things? But also, how are we going to advance mobility? So there's an MIT-designed wheelchair there, which is absolutely brilliant. It uses a mechanical advantage to allow people who use wheelchairs to move across all kinds of terrain, assuming they're young enough and strong enough to do that. But it's more that this is an example of how design is being used to create ways for people to get around that aren't as dependent on having smooth infrastructure, but more repairable infrastructure. So that's another thing to think about. And then here, in terms of responsive communities, for me, this is maybe one of the biggest issues. This is the aftermath of Hurricane Matthew in Florida, and the Red Cross recently wrote about how to deal with elderly patients and patients with dementia when they're dealing with natural disasters. And the protocol is to get the elderly patients who are in better mental and physical health into shelters sooner to provide a predictable environment for those with dementia so that they are welcomed into something that has a structure and a pattern. So I would suggest that how we organize as communities to have relationships intergenerationally, which is what our wonderful beginning speaker suggested we do, is going to be very, very important. How we build cohesive communities to respond to maybe some things not turning out the ways we would hope they would is going to be super important. So I'll just leave you with two words, and they are rugged and responsive. And with that, I thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.